Friends, today we are going to discuss a very important concept of macroeconomics, very important theory of macroeconomics. It's called ISLM model or ISLM theory. This particular model has got very significance use in analyzing macroeconomic behavior of an economy. Often you will find that at any point of time economy is decelerating or economy is booming. In both the cases you have certain concerns. In case of economy is getting into recession or slowing down, your concern is that how to reverse the trend of GDP growth rate or GDP growth. Your concern is how to ensure that unemployment does not rise. Your concern is that there is sufficient demand in the economy to ensure that prices do not fall, which might hurt the suppliers. Similarly, when the economy booms, you always have concern primarily on the front that it may not lead to rise in inflationary situations, which might hurt those whose wages or income are not compensated as per rise in prices. So you have to devise certain economic policies to counter the problems arising out of economic fluctuations in the economy. What kind of economic policy will follow? What kind of economic policy will adopt? That requires certain foundation, certain basis. And it is the ISLM model that functions as a base or framework to guide you what kind of economic policies you should follow. Now the question arises, what is economic policies? A student of macroeconomics who has reached to the level of ISLM model must understand what is economic policies. There are two economic policies. One is the fiscal policy and another one is the monetary policy. You often hear these two terms while you are reading newspapers, while you are participating in any television channel programs, when you are watching them. So you will always encounter. So let us first understand what is fiscal policy, what is monetary policy, so that we can contextualize the significance of ISLM model in the context of fiscal policy and monetary policy. If you look at fiscal policy, the fiscal policy is a gamut of expenditure and revenue policies of the government. You often see on annual basis whether it is the central government, whether it is the state government, whether it is the local governments, makes budget. Primarily the central government and state governments, right? Now this budget exercise is nothing but it is an exercise of presenting a count of expenditure of the government and the sources of revenue and the total revenue. So budget is nothing but what kind of expenditure policy is being adopted by the government, what kind of revenue policies being adopted by the government is what we call fiscal policy, and that is what is presented in the budget. So fiscal policy is primarily the prerogative of government, be it central government or state governments, because they decide where to spend money, whether to spend money on building hospitals, whether to spend money on building roads, whether to spend money on procuring arms from outside, whether to spend money on buildings, good health infrastructure and schools, etc. Similarly, whether the tax would be collected in the form of GST or value-added tax, or what should be the direct tax rate, what should be the corporate tax rate. I mean, these are all the policies which are part of revenue policy and which are shown in the budget presentations of the governments, right? So the fiscal policy to make brief here, that fiscal policy is nothing but policies associated with government's revenue and capital expenditures and revenues in the form of varieties of taxes, right? So this is what your fiscal policy is. Then comes the monetary policy. That is another significant economic policies which are often exercised in the economy. I mean, we are at this moment in the midst of corona crisis, and recently we have observed that how Federal Bank of USA has reduced the policy rate, which is again going to influence the Indian banks also, and Indian Central Bank is also going to reduce its policy rate most probably. So such kind of policies are being adopted by the central bank, and what that policy would be called, that policy would be called monetary policy. So the important component of economic policy is also monetary policy. And what is monetary policy? Monetary policy is that policy which aims to control money supply in the economy. And what I mean, it can either think of increasing money supply, or it can think of decreasing money supply. So recently, if the Federal Bank of the USA is bringing down the policy rate, it intends to increase the money supply. Similarly, in India, if RBI brings down the repo rate or reverse repo rate, it intends to increase money supply in the economy. So monetary policy is policy which controls money supply in the economy, and it uses various instruments to control the money supply. One being cash reserve ratio in case of India, you have repo rate, you have reverse repo rate, you have bank rate, you have open market operations, right? Just to clarify, that open market operation is the sale and purchase of government bonds or government securities by the RBI in the market. That is called open market operations. Now, all these instruments, if they are exercised, they have their implications with respect to money supply in the economy. So you have got fiscal policy and monetary policy, right, being very important constituent of economic policy, which are often exercised, and therefore we need to have that framework in mind, which are used to devise the fiscal policy and monetary policy, looking at the situation of economy. And this is where ISLM model becomes very important. If you look at this origin of ISLM model, again, it is basic concept which is talking about the initials of ISLM model. J.R. Hicks, he wrote a paper called Mr. Kinson Classics, which was published in Econometrica, a very well-known, well-established economics journal, way back in 1937. Remember, it was the time when the global economy was into deep crisis, and Keynes had written his book General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, and was published in 1936. And as part of some way reviewing the book, J.R. Hicks ended up with his article called Mr. Keynes and Classics. In fact, ISLM model, which was developed by John Hicks, was nothing but an extension of Keynes' theory of income determinations. Uh, what is the Keynes theory of income determinations? It is primarily a theory which emphasizes greater role on aggregate demand in determinations of equilibrium level of income in the economy. Right? So Keynes argued that if you want to raise the level of income, equilibrium level of income in the economy, you need to raise the aggregate demand. If you want to reduce the equilibrium level of income, you reduce the aggregate demand. So it is the aggregate demand which determines equilibrium level of income in the economy, and this is where it differs from the classical perspective, where classical economics says that given demand, it is the supply side factors which determine the level of income in the economy. If supply of factors of productions rises, that leads to rise in aggregate that leads to rise in output, and if supply of factors of productions falls, that leads to fall in level of output, and demand has no role to play because supply creates its own demand. So given the failure of supply side economics in during the period of economic slump, great economic depressions of 1929, Keynes wrote his book and he propounded the theory of income determinations. We said that the classical economics did not emphasize much on aggregate demand, and that was the missing aspect in analyzing an economic behavior of any country at aggregate level. So he emphasized more on aggregate demand. He said that it is the aggregate demand determines income level in the economy rather than supply determining level of income in the economy. So keeping that Keynes theory in mind, Hicks was quite supporter of that theory, and he basically extended and developed his model of ISLM. In what way it differs from Keynes' theory of income determinations? ISLM model differs from Keynes' theory of income determination only to the extent that Keynes assumed that aggregate demand in the economy is only function of income, right? Which means that if income rises, aggregate demand would rise. If income falls, aggregate demand would fall. However, aggregate demand does play a role in determinations of income also. That is the interdependency of aggregate demand and output. But when he said that aggregate demand is only function of income, he related aggregate demand being function of income through consumption. That consumption being part of aggregate demand, right, is function of income, and therefore whole aggregate demand becomes the function of income. Otherwise, the remaining components apart from consumptions, for example investment, government expenditure and net export, Keynes assumed to be autonomous. They are given, right? Income has no role to play in determinations of those components. They're just consumptions. So if you look at the components of aggregate demand, which was given by Keynes, which consist of consumption, investment, government expenditure and net export. Investment, government expenditure, net exports were taken as autonomous, and it was only consumption as function of income, right? So therefore aggregate demand is the function of income according to Keynes. But Keynes differed to the extent that it is not only consumption is it's aggregate demand is not only the function of income, but it is also function of interest rate. And this was the new introduction of Hicks in the model of Keynes income determinations theory. So he said that okay, consumption is the function of income, But investment is not autonomous. Investment is influenced by interest rate, and that is how your overall aggregate demand in ISLM model becomes the function of income as well as interest rate, right? Now, what determines the interest rate? Interest rate is monetary phenomena, right? It always occurs in the context of money, right? It does not occur in the context of wheat or rice or any car. I mean, so interest rate occurs only whenever there is lending or borrowing of money, right? So the interest rate is purely monetary phenomena. Now, Hicks said, and also Keynes had argued, that interest rate is determined by demand and supply of money, right? It is the demand and supply forces of money which determine the level of interest rate. And given the fact that interest rate plays a role in determinations of investment, and investment being part of aggregate demand, what happens that goods market and money market become interdependent. So you can't analyze the goods market keeping money market in abeyance, right? Uh, uh, you know, wishing away money market, you can't analyze the goods market. Okay, so given this fact that goods market is dependent upon money market, right? You can't analyze the behavior in goods market, right, wishing away or keeping away money market, right? So in Keynes income determinations theory, the what do you call, money market was kept in abeyance, right? And Keynes assumed that investment is autonomous. It has nothing to do with the interest rate. But Hicks uh, did away that assumptions, and he said that no, investment is function of interest rate, and interest rate is determined in money market. Therefore, goods market and money market become interdependent. Uh, if you look at this picture, what I have shown here the underlying assumptions of ISLM model, which was thought out by Hicks, that goods market and financial market, they are interdependent on each other. Goods market is dependent upon financial market, and financial market is dependent upon goods market. In reality also, I mean, you see today, because of the coronavirus, what you have is that the supply chain is getting affected, production is getting affected, and that is what influencing the financial market. You have what do you call, uh, stock market is slowing down or crashing in many countries. Okay, so this is how you can find that financial market is dependent upon goods market. Also, when there is slowdown in the economy, it is primarily the banks who get affected. Their NPA rises, they start defaulting. So here you have financial market being dependent upon goods market, but simultaneous goods market is also dependent upon financial market, right? If a stock market booms, what happens that most of the businessmen, they start issuing IPOs, they start mobilizing funds from the stock market, and they invest, and production picks up. Similarly, the interest rate when goes down in the banking sector, right? The businessmen, tend to borrow from banks, and they invest, and when they invest, production, etc., take place. When interest rate goes down, you also find the people start taking loan from the banks, start buying vehicles, start buying houses, right? So what you have in reality, that goods market and financial market are interdependent, right? And given this interdependency of goods market and financial market, you can't analyze one market in isolation of others, right? So here, given this interdependency of goods market and money market, Keynes' income determination theory remains incomplete if it does not take into account simultaneously what happens in financial market. And this is where ISLM model is an improvement, because in reality we do have economy which is divided across two sectors, goods market and financial market, and they are interdependent upon each other. Therefore, when you are talking about the determinations of GDP or determinations of income and employment, you must take this reality of interdependence and then develop a model which can analyze the behavior of an economy in goods market and also in money market. So this is the basic assumptions of ISLM model, that goods market and money market, or goods market or financial market, are interdependent. You might have seen me often using money market for financial market or financial market for money market. In fact, if you look at the financial market basically consists of money market and assets market, right? What is money market? Money market is the market where you have got demand and supply of money. And asset market is that market where there exists demand and supply of non-money financial assets, right? So if you look at overall financial market, what it consists of? It consists of bonds, it consists of securities, it consists of fixed deposits, it consists of deposits, it consists of many other varieties of financial instruments which are bought and sold, right? Which are bought and sold, and they are bought and sold to gain certain return. Okay, so if I take let us say that in a very simplified financial market we have got money market, and in non-money financial assets market we have got only bond market, right? So the bond is alternative of money, right? So your financial market basically consists of demand and supply of bonds and demand and supply of money, right? Now suppose if your financial market is in equilibrium, so what do you have? You have demand for money plus demand for bonds is equal to supply of money plus supply of bonds, right? This is the conditions of equilibrium of a financial market, right? The demand for money plus demand for bond must be equal to supply of money plus supply of bonds, because both money and bonds represent a kind of financial assets. One is money, one is non-money financial assets, right? I am talking this relationship, or I'm talking the disaggregated form of financial market primarily to make you understand that ISLM model, though it talks about the relationship in goods market and money market, but here money market stands for overall financial market, and in that context I am here dividing financial market into money market and non-money financial assets market, right, or bond market. So if you have demand for money plus demand for bonds being equal to supply of money plus supply of bond, so in that equilibrium conditions we can have logical conclusion that if demand for money plus demand for bond is equal to supply of money plus supply of bond, then demand for money minus supply of money, that means if you take the supply of money to the left hand side, you have got demand for money minus supply of money, right, is equal to supply of bonds minus demand for bonds. Now in case suppose if demand for money is equal to supply of money, what does it mean? That money market is in equilibrium, Okay, so if demand for money is exactly equal to supply of money, that means money market is in equilibrium, you will have left hand side being 0, which implies that even non-money financial assets market is in equilibrium. That means supply of bonds is equal to demand for bonds, and therefore when money market is in equilibrium, then assets market or non-money financial assets market also is in equilibrium. And when given this, when I'm analyzing or just taking money market into analysis, simultaneously I am also talking about the analysis of bonds market, right? So if money market is in equilibrium, the bonds market will also be in equilibrium. Hence, analysis of money market is equivalent to analysis of bonds market. Now, having discussed, what do you call, uh, overall financial market, and saying that money market and bonds market, they are this interdependent upon each other, and analyzing one is synonyms of analyzing other as well, right? So in that context, what do you call, keeping that in mind, we have now what is this ISLM model. So it is a model that analyzes the determinations of equilibrium level of income, assuming the interdependence of goods and money market, right? So as we have shown, initially we discussed about what is economic policy, right? And then we came to discuss that goods market and money market are interdependent, and then we talked about how money market is the same thing as financial assets market or non-money financial assets market, right? After discussing that, we now look at what is ISLM model. It is a model that analyzes the determinations of equilibrium level of income, assuming the interdependence of goods and money market, right? This ISLM model what do you call, helps us to find out the role of fiscal policy in determinations of equilibrium income, and it also helps us to find out whether the fiscal policy would be effective or not, and if it would be effective, to what extent it would be effective. So in essence, ISLM model describes the role of fiscal policy in determinations of equilibrium income and its effectiveness. It not only describes the role of fiscal policy, right, that we discussed in the beginning, what is fiscal policy, but it also describes the role of monetary policy in determinations of equilibrium income and its effectiveness also, right? So it is the ISLM model which is used by monetary authority to influence the equilibrium level of income, right? And they can also find out whether their monetary policy would be effective or not, right? So ISLM model is basically a model which helps anyone, be it business man, policymakers, etc., right, to understand that whether fiscal policy will be effective or not, if it will be effective, to what extent it will be effective in raising the level of income. It also helps to understand whether monetary policy would be effective or not, and it would be effective, then to what extent it would be effective in influencing the level of income or not. So this is what your ISLM model is.